All right, moving right along with our muscle physiology here. Now we're going to talk about muscle twitches and sustained muscular contractions. Next topic here. First of all, what do we mean by a muscle twitch? Okay, what a muscle twitch is, let me see, do we have it on the next? Yes, we do. A muscle twitch, what a muscle twitch really means is it's a response of a muscle to a single brief stimulus, threshold stimulus. So you generate an action potential across the skeletal muscle membrane, that sarcolemma, and that leads to some cross bridging between actin and myosin. Myosin. This is the simplest contraction that you would be able to observe, and the force of the contraction can actually be measured graphically. This is called a myogram, where you're actually measuring and recording the force of a muscle contraction. So that's what you're seeing here on the screen. This is called a myogram. If I can get my pen to write here. Okay, so over here on the y-axis there is representing increasing force of contraction or tension within the muscle, and then down here we have time, and our time is in ms. Again, that means milliseconds, so that's 1 millisecond is 1/1000th of a second. Okay, so a single muscle twitch is what results from a single action potential sent by a motor neuron that controls a skeletal muscle. So the little arrow here is showing you that stimulus. That's going to be the action potential, the signal from the motor neuron. And there are three phases to this twitch. Notice there's a latent period there, which takes just a few milliseconds. And then you start your maximum period of contraction. So here is where you're getting your cross bridging taking place. Now, why do you think you have that little lag there, that latent period initially? So if you think back to all that rigmarole we learned about a few video lectures before, motor neuron sends an action potential over to the muscle fiber. Or the motor neuron generates an action potential that causes acetylcholine to be secreted across the synaptic cleft. The acetylcholine binds to its receptor on the muscle fiber membrane. That sets off an action potential on the muscle fiber membrane. That action potential travels down into the T tubules. That triggers calcium to come out of the sarcoplasmic reticulum, the SR. Hopefully that story is becoming very familiar to you. Now, you should really be able to outline that story step by step to make sure that you understand that sequence of events. It is very logical once you walk through it and learn how to outline it, but if you just try to memorize bits and pieces and terminology, it's never really going to make sense. So you want to be able to outline that process in a step-by-step manner. All right, we had to get the calcium out of the SR, and then the calcium binds to the troponin. The troponin slides the tropomyosin ribbon away, and now finally we can start the cross bridging between the actin and the myosins. All right, so all that is what's happening here in that little latent period for just a few milliseconds. It doesn't take very long for all that to happen. And then your actin and your myosins start their cross bridging cycles. They're sliding across each other, and that's what you're seeing here. Now with one stimulus, that's one action potential from the motor neuron, actin and the myosins are going to cross bridge. They're going to generate a certain amount of tension. They're just going to slide across each other so far. And remember that the calcium ions are getting bottled back up. So the calcium ions are pumped back into the SR, which means they're also going to come off of the troponin. If you don't keep releasing more and more calcium ions are going to come off of the troponin, which allows the tropomyosin to slide back over those binding sites on actin, and your cross bridges break. So gradually you lose your muscle tension. You're breaking the cross bridges. and you go back to a relaxed state. And that whole thing took, what, about 130 milliseconds. So that's just a little over a tenth of a second, instantaneous as far as we're concerned. All right, so that's called one muscle twitch. All right, so muscle twitches differ in terms of their duration depending on the muscle that you're thinking about. So smaller muscles will generally have shorter twitch periods. So on the last graph, we were looking at one that took about 130 milliseconds. But an extraocular muscle, like the lateral rectus muscle, now that's not one you have to learn for the anatomy portion of this unit. That's one of the small, tiny muscles over on the lateral side that helps out with eye movements. And so you can see one twitch takes the whole thing from stimulation to generating your contraction to relaxing. It doesn't take very long. Looks like maybe about 10 milliseconds. Then your gastrocnemius muscle, the superficial muscle on the back of the lower leg, your calf, the one that we call our calf muscle, it goes through a whole twitch in about 80 milliseconds. The soleus, your deeper calf muscle, the one that's deep to the gastrocnemius, goes out to about 200 milliseconds for each twitch. So your muscles where you're going to have finer movements are going to have faster twitches. That allows for greater control. Muscles that don't require fine, precise control, like the soleus, will have longer twitch times. It's okay for them to keep contracting longer due to just one stimulation from a motor neuron. Okay, now you guys know that typically when you're using your muscles, you don't just have like one twitch that lasts a fraction of a second. That's not really how they work. In reality, your skeletal muscle fibers are receiving repeat stimulation, stimulus, 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 multiple action potentials from motor neurons, so that they will maintain contraction for as long as they're needed. And this gets into graded muscle responses, which will refer to variations in the degree of muscle contraction, how forceful that muscle contraction is going to be, how long it's going to last. And this is going to be required for controlling our skeletal muscles properly. So how do we do this? There are a couple of things you can do. One is that you change the frequency of the stimulation. Okay. And that's stimulation from the motor neuron, action potentials from the motor neuron. The more frequent a motor neuron sends action potential, action potential, action potential, action potential, that's going to result in longer, stronger contractions. Also, the strength of the stimulus. And that's really getting into brain control. So the motor neurons that control your skeletal muscles, the small motor units, the motor neurons that control small motor units, are stimulated more easily by the brain. The brain can recruit those and tell those, hey, you need to stimulate your muscle fibers more quickly. Your larger motor units need more signaling from the brain, more powerful stimulation from the brain before they're going to generate their action potentials and tell their muscle fibers to contract. And so that's what allows us to have these nice graded muscle responses and nice smooth movements and just the right amount of force that we need to make the things that we need to do happen. All right, so let's take a look at how this happens. So here's a myogram again. So I know this looks like an action potential diagram, but it's not. So we're looking at muscle tension rather than voltage across the cell membrane. So here's a twitch again. So the red arrow there is a stimulus. That's from the motor neuron. One stimulus leads to contraction, relaxation. and all those things that we just talked about. And for this pretend muscle we're talking about here, a whole twitch lasts about 100 milliseconds. All right. Now we're going to see what happens when a motor neuron sends action potential, action potential, action potential, action potential, because that is in reality what happens. So if you increase the frequency of the stimulus like that, the muscle doesn't have time to completely relax. So on your muscle twitch diagram, it's going up and then coming all the way back down. But if you keep action potential, action potential, action potential, action potential happening, you're not going to have time for complete relaxation before you've re-stimulated. Okay, because every time an action potential comes from a motor neuron and sets off that chain of events, the EC coupling, your excitation contraction coupling, calcium ions are going to come out of the SR and they're going to stimulate further contraction. This is something that's called summation. So multiple stimuli summate or increase the overall contraction force. And then we're going to see you do reach a point where contraction just stays sustained. You don't have any relaxation occurring between stimuli, and you're also at the maximum power that you can generate within a particular muscle. So let's take a look at a picture of this. Okay, so here we're back on a myogram again, and what we're taking a look at here, red arrow means a motor neuron's action potential, sets off a muscle twitch. All right, calcium ions start getting bottled back up in the SR, so we start breaking our cross bridges. We start relaxing, but then before we can go all the way back to a fully relaxed state, down here, we have another stimulus from the motor neuron. Okay, so your cross bridges start sliding across each other again, and then they start relaxing. You start breaking your cross bridges, but then boom, you have another stimulation. Actin and myosin filaments start sliding across each other again. They start relaxing. Boom, another action potential occurs. And then what are you noticing there about the tension over here? Each time you have a new stimulation coming, the tension in the muscle is getting stronger and stronger and stronger. And what's happening there, so if you imagine your actins and your myosins, after the first stimulation, they're starting off like this, and they might slide this far. Okay, and then you start to have some relaxation, but then boom, you have another stimulation, and before all these actin and myosins can break apart, they're going to start sliding a little bit further. And then you're going to have another stimulus, they slide a little bit further. Another stimulus, they slide a little bit further. So your sarcomeres within the muscle fiber are getting shorter and shorter and shorter. You're generating more and more and more and more tension with each stimulation that takes place. Okay, this type of situation where your muscle is doing this type of thing with its contraction force is sometimes called unfused or incomplete tetanus, and we'll talk about what tetanus is in a minute. Now you're probably familiar with tetanus as lockjaw, but tetanus here is going to refer to a sustained maximal contraction. And this stair-stepping effect that you have is also sometimes called treppy, which is a German term, if I'm not mistaken, for what's going on there where you're stair-stepping upward with your contractions. All right, now this is what happens when you are going to maximally contract a muscle. All right, so notice down here on the bottom, the motor neuron is sending action potentials, boom, 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 boom. It looks like every 10 milliseconds or so, the motor neuron is fire, 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 fire. And so you start the cross bridges, and there's no time for the cross bridges to relax before the next stimulus has come from the motor neuron. It's just boom, 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 one right after the other. Now, eventually, you're going to get to a point where you're at the maximum strength of contraction. So when you have a sustained maximum state of cross-bridging that can occur, so your actins and your myosins have cross-bridged as far as they can cross-bridge, and they're maintaining that cross-bridging, maintaining that force within the muscle, that is called muscle tetany or tetanus. And do y'all know what tetanus is? An illness that's caused by a type of bacteria that makes a toxin that prevents your muscles from relaxing. So they're in a permanent contracted state. They're permanently in tetanus in severe cases. And so that's where the name of the disease tetanus actually came from. Tetanus is commonly called lockjaw because the symptoms of it occur in the jaw muscles first. All right, now eventually, when the stimulations stop, then those cross bridges are going to break and you're going to go back into a relaxed state once the stimulations stop. Okay, I erased all my scribble scratch on there. Now what about a fatigued muscle though? What would happen? So let's say the motor neuron keeps stimulating, but eventually you're going to run out of the energy supply that you need. You're going to deplete your ATP. Remember, you need ATP for muscle contraction. We're going to hear a little bit more about this later. But when you run out of fuel, even if the motor neuron is still stimulating, you're gradually going to stair-step down your muscle contraction. You know, it's going to try to keep contracting. It's going to try to keep making those cross bridges happen, but it's not going to be successful at doing so. So you're going to stair-step down to a relaxed state. And you've probably experienced that before. If you're using your muscles for a long period of time and they become exhausted, what do they start doing? They start quivering. And that is evidence for this stair-stepping effect that you're seeing in the muscles, where they're cross-bridging but then relaxing a little bit, cross-bridging, relaxing a little bit, and the generation of the tension in there actually goes down instead of upward. All right, so again, this is really more of what we see going on in a skeletal muscle rather than an individual muscle twitch. All right, so the next topic we're going to return to this concept of force of muscle contractions. How can we control the force? Lighter forces versus stronger forces of muscle contractions. That'll be the topic for the next video lecture.